Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Sorry, I'm miscommunicating there. I'm not going to preach on the gospel much today. I'm going to talk about a real fun topic called racism. So we're going to talk about it because it's come up a lot, and I think it's worthwhile that the church, that we get the church's perspective on issues that our country is facing. I don't know about you, but I thought to myself, it sure seems like a lot of old-timey bad guys are coming back, right? You know, you're watching the news and you've got, you know, Nazis and Ku Klux Klan members, and you kind of thought that that was maybe something of the past, right? And like, that seems kind of a flashback to something that we used to, you know. We have, I mean, do we have any World War II vets here? Do we have any? No? No, we don't. Okay. I was thinking, you know, stuff like that must be hard to see for people who fought in a war, you know, to defeat, you know, people carrying Nazi flags. But, you know, we can think to ourselves, how did something like this just all of a sudden, you know, come back, right? But the truth of it is, it didn't come out of nowhere. Stuff like this just sort of goes dormant or hides, or it's always there. It's just like in our own personal lives, when we have bad habits and sins from the past that come back and haunt us, that kind of reemerge, that we thought we had defeated, that we thought we had control over, and all of a sudden it crops back up in our lives again. It's not that it sort of came out of nowhere again, right? It's just that there was little remnants of it left in us, and we had the right stressors and the right circumstances that brought it out. And so, you know, when we look at everything that's happening around us, we have to ourselves, what is the church's response to all of this? And I think the thing to remember is that this is a serious issue. You know, like, this is also a problem within the Orthodox Church. There are a, you know, not insignificant number of white supremacists and white nationalists and stuff like that within the Orthodox Church. On social media, it doesn't take very long to find it. And in fact, there are people who are drawn to the Orthodox Church because, in practice, we look so segregationist and ethnocentric, right? What do we do? How do we divide ourselves? Right? There's a church for Greeks, there's a church for Russians, there's a church for Serbs over here, right? We do that, right? And we divide ourselves up into all of our different ethnic groups, and not all churches are like this, but some of them are a lot less welcoming. I had a friend once who, you know, went to a Serbian church, and he goes, you know, are you Serbian? No. I was like, oh, well, there's another church down the road for you. Okay? I had another guy who, he's black, he went to a Greek church, and a man told him to go stand in the back. Okay? So it's, you know, some of that's like, you know, your old racist grandpa who says, I have a grandpa like that, who would just say, you know, terrible things, and you have to tell him, like, you can't say that, grandpa, you know, that's not appropriate. But there is a bigger problem of people looking at the Orthodox Church and thinking that it supports certain beliefs that it doesn't, based on how we act. And it's a problem. And there, you know, if you pay attention to social media, you've seen a lot of sort of inappropriate things being said by Orthodox lay people and clergy, that some of that were just inappropriate to say in the aftermath of people being killed. And some of it borderline racist comments. And I think part of the problem is that there's a sense that we feel that we can say anything now, right? There's a sense in the culture that we can just be rude, right? That we can all be jerks now, and we can say whatever we want. And part of that is in response to sort of, right, an excessive amount of political correctness, right? Where you have to say everything just right, and people sort of have had enough of that, right? And they feel like they're always being shamed and browbeaten for saying the slightest thing that's off. So this is sort of an overreaction to some of this. But if you look at the church and you look at what it stands for, the gospel of Christ is completely incompatible with any sort of racism or bigotry or prejudice, right? In fact, the church is supposed to be the remedy for that. What does Jesus say to his disciples before he ascends into heaven? He says what? He says, Go, therefore, into all the nations, making disciples, right? It says, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and what? The other ends of the earth, right? Something about Christianity was different. It was not a race-based, national-based, or ethnic-based religion. And it was really unique in this facet. And that's probably why it spread so far and so wide, is that it didn't tie itself to this. There's a great quote. The Synod did put out a statement. The Synod put out a statement that was quite good in response to it. And they had a quote in there by an ancient saint called St. Justin Martyr. And in there, Justin Martyr makes this quote. It says, before we found Christ, we would hate each other. We would use all the differences and divisions with us to mistrust and mistreat one another. But now that we are in Christ together, we sit down, we eat with, we live with, and we love the people whom we once hated. This is very early. This is second century. This is very early stuff, right? And there was it's been very clear throughout the history of the church that the church is all about bringing everyone in. And in fact, in the church there is this radical equality. You know, there's differences, right, in us. There's this radical equality. So if you're king or you're powerful or rich and you come in, you know what? When you come to that chalice, you're the same as everybody else. You're not any better. You're not any worse. You know, and this is part of the whole point of forgiveness, right? Is that everyone gets access to salvation and everything equally. But you know, the church, we're often hesitant, aren't we, right, to wade into things that become political, and everything seems to be politicized today, right? The church is cautious, right? We don't want to say things that are political. We don't want to weigh too much in on social or cultural issues. Why? For good reason. You can often get it wrong, right? It causes a lot of division. It upsets a lot of people, and sometimes you can compromise the gospel, and the church can be more about some political or cultural ideology, more so than it is about the gospel of Christ. And I think if you look at evangelicals, and I came from that background, that's a problem. That is a real problem. That's why a lot of young evangelicals have left that church, and why a lot of people don't feel welcome, is because it seems like it's more sort of some political army than it does a place of spirituality. And so there's a danger on both sides, right? Of saying too much, but also of saying too little. And the problem with not saying anything is that we've sort of come to believe in, and this is partly due to American culture, right? Where the individual is really emphasized, that religion is somehow a private concern. This is the Protestant ethos, the privatization of religion. That the gospel, the church, Jesus has only things to say about you and your own private sins and problems, and doesn't have anything to say about society or something like that. Or that you should keep your faith just to yourself, right? And not really bring it out into any sort of public sphere. That is completely contrary to everything in the gospel and everything in our own Orthodox tradition. If you look at Jesus and you look at what he preaches, okay, what does he preach about? The majority of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, the issues he's referring to are not private matters, but social and public problems and injustices and ways that we as groups of people, right, sin together. And who is Jesus concerned about in the gospel? The poor, right? Women, children, the weak, the powerless, the foreigner, the alien, right? These are the people he's concerned with. If you look at all the parables and all the preaching of Jesus, the overwhelming majority of the time, it is economic injustices, oppression of peoples, and racism or tribalism, I want to put that, right? People sort of treating other people less because of whatever distinction that they've drawn up in some way, okay? Like, oh, she's had a couple of husbands. We don't have to treat her as good as somebody else, right? You know, whatever. Oh, he's a Samaritan. He's across this mountainside, so we don't have to treat him with dignity or respect in some way, right? these are the things that Jesus is most occupied with. And if you go into the prophets, right? If you look at, say look at John the Baptist, what does he do? The same thing. You look into the prophets, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, right? What do they talk about? The same things. Okay? And this is the reason. The reason that so many public and shared sins are talked about is because salvation is not a private matter, right? You're not saved all by yourself, alone somewhere, right? At least that's not the Orthodox tradition. The Orthodox tradition is that the church is saved, and you're part of the church, right? You're part of a group. You're saved together with other people. And the saying is that the only thing you do alone in the church is go to hell. Because that's what hell is. It's isolation, right? It's complete individualization. And what do we call the thing we do when we take the bread and the wine, right? The body and blood of Christ. We call it what? Communion. I mean, what is that? I mean, think about it. It's so obvious, right? What does that mean? It means about coming together and being in union together. I mean, that's what this is all about, right? It's all of us trying to live together in love and peace, which is way more difficult than it is. And the great sort of hope, and maybe it seems like folly to people who aren't Christians, but the hope of the church is that we can live in peace and love with people who are as different from us as they could possibly be, right? That's the hope of love, that it can overcome all of that other stuff which we so easily fall into. Now the church is hesitant to wade into these issues, except when it comes to what? Sex, right? Think about it, right? I mean, and there's good reason. There's a lot of stuff going on that can be said, right? But how often does Jesus talk about sex? Hardly at all. And when he does, it's almost always the social ramifications of it, right? It's almost always kind of the way it's used as a way to sort of oppress and sort of crush people in some way. So not that that's not important, right? But that we need to make sure as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, that our priorities are right, that our priorities match the gospel, okay? And that they're not flown around by the whims of sort of popular opinion and the things that concern people and the ideologies of the day. But that it's rooted in what Jesus, the example that he has set for us. And so if we only wade in on certain sexual issues, and we don't speak out about the things that concern Christ the most, that compromises our moral authority and our ability to help people and speak out. And it also diminishes the prophetic voice of the church. One of the roles of the church is to be a prophetic voice, which means it does what John the Baptist does when there's evil and corruption, especially when the weak and powerless are being crushed. The church speaks out. And it does it willing to take the consequences, even to the point of death. That's what the witnesses of the martyrs always are. That they're willing to die to defend and love their brother. But the chances are that you and I are probably racists. Okay? So it's nice to talk about how, oh, there's so many bad people out there, right? I mean, this is always the danger of talking about sort of like injustices and public sins, is that we're never guilty of them. It's always somebody else, right? Which makes us feel righteous, which is a problem. Because the reality is that we might not be, and hardly anybody is, an explicit sort of racist, right? It uses the N-word and really believes that people of a different, race or phenotype are actually less human, right? Very few people really believe that. But what you and I fall into and are probably guilty of is what I would call diet racism, right? Which is the small stuff, right? The little tiny things, the thoughts, the attitudes, the ways in which we feel uncomfortable around someone who's different than us. We judge them before we know them. We make assumptions about them based on whatever group they happen to belong to. And racism isn't just, when we break this down, racism just is composed of two things, which is prejudice and bigotry. And prejudice simply means prejudging. It means judging somebody, an individual, based on the group that they're a part of, right? Before we know anything about them as an individual. And bigotry is action, right? It's treating that person less than human based on the group that they belong to. And so we do this, and I think the problem is not just race, right? Okay, the problem is any sort of difference, right? Or division or distinction that we can apply to somebody, right? In which we can use that to dehumanize them in some way. And we have to be vigilant about that. We have to watch our thoughts and scrutinize them. And we have to rebuke ourselves when we do and say things that treat somebody different, that doesn't treat them with the respect and dignity they deserve, when we make assumptions about them. And we do this in lots of small little ways. Maybe a little comment we make, a little thought that we have. Maybe there's someone who's different, and so we're more hesitant to help them or give to them because they're part of another group, right? There's lots of small ways that we do that. Maybe someone who's different than us walks by the street, so we clutch our purse closer and we walk away from them, right? We do little things like that. And we have to be careful that we're not also treating people differently based on the group that they belong to, or the faith that they have, or how they're different to us. So the challenge for us is to repent, is to watch our own hearts. And the way that the church defeats racism and bigotry and prejudice and all these things that are quite evil is it doesn't march and shout and shake its fist and hold signs and hit other people, okay, who say terrible things. It doesn't do that, right? It doesn't hate people who hate. What does it do?
Praise for them.
Yeah, praise for them. It loves them. It defeats your enemies by making them your friends. Look at Jesus. How did he defeat death? By dying, right? He didn't defeat it. He defeated it in a form of weakness. And so the same thing as the church is, how do we respond to really abhorrent and disgusting hate? With love. We have to love those people. We cannot treat them less than human because their beliefs might be different than ours. We have to love them too. And shouting at them and waving signs in their face and shaking our fist at them isn't going to do very much. There's a story, I'll leave it with this. There's a story about this black man who he went around and he had interviews and he set up these meetings with KKK members, right? And he would sit down face to face with them and meet them and interview them, and he would befriend these people. This guy, you know what? I'll share the link of the video on the Facebook website because it's really marvelous. He made friends with all these KKK members, and almost all of them all left the KKK because of the friendships that he forged with them. Was willing to sit down and talk to them face to face, and didn't hate them, and wasn't afraid of them, and showed them real Christian love. And this guy, through love, changed people's hearts. That's what we have to do. We have to make sure that we're guarding our own heart, and we're not feeling so righteous, okay, self-righteous, that we don't also do the same things in a smaller measure. And that we make sure that we're responding to hate with love. Because that's the Christian way. That's the example that Jesus Christ sets for us in the gospel. And we have no other but choice to follow him. Lord Jesus Christ.
Lord.